Today we're doing a deep dive into H63D syndrome. It's this condition linked to a genetic thing, a mutation, that affects how your body handles iron.
And why it gets missed so often is, honestly, it's pretty startling when you dig into it.
It really is. So our mission today, using information from TWA Science Media's How to Detect H63D Syndrome, is to sort of shine a light on this medical blind spot.
Yeah, how can something with pretty clear signs and blood work just, fly under the radar so consistently? And what does that really mean for people's health?
Let's get into it. What's the core problem here? Why the blind spot?
Well, the source suggests it really boils down to a gap in medical training. You see, the science has known about non-transferrin-bound iron, let's call it NTBI, for a long time.
NTBI.
But the standard medical textbooks, the traditional training, it just hasn't really emphasized it enough. It's like, you can only see what you're trained to look for, right?
Right. So doctors aren't primed to recognize the signs of it.
Pretty much. And here's the kicker, the real paradox. H63D syndrome actually leaves a very specific, quite clear signature in routine lab results.
A signature that, according to the source, is showing up thousands of times every single day in labs all over the world.
Thousands. Yet, it's like reading a language most doctors haven't quite been taught. The information's there, but it often just isn't interpreted correctly.
And you mentioned something before we started recording about the situation in the U.S.
Yeah, the source touches on how, in the U.S. particularly, issues related to iron often fall squarely into the territory of hematologists, blood specialists.
Okay.
Which might mean other doctors, specialists or even primary care docs, might be less likely to connect these specific iron markers if they don't think it's strictly a blood issue. It kind of silos the problem.
That makes sense. So, okay, what is this specific signature, this pattern? The source calls it a pathognomonic four-value constellation. Sounds technical.
It does, but let's break it down. It's basically 4 key lab values. First one, ferritin levels.
Okay, ferritin, that's the iron storage protein.
Exactly.
Okay.
In H63D, ferritin is persistently low or at least decreased. Think like consistently in the lower half of the lab's normal range, maybe even a bit under sometimes.
So not necessarily alarmingly low on its own, but consistently down there. Got it. What's number 2?
Number 2 is decreased transferrin. That's the protein that transports iron in the blood.
Okay.
Typically, it's maybe 5 to 20% below the lab's normal range. But here's the really crucial bit, the big flag. It's static.
Static, meaning?
Meaning it barely changes even after you eat iron-rich food. Normally, transferrin levels might fluctuate a bit after a meal, but with H63D, it tends to stay stubbornly low. That lack of response is key.
Huh. Okay, static low transferrin, that's important. What's the third value?
Third is transferrin saturation. This one's often, or at least frequently, above 50%.
50%. And why is that number so significant?
Because that's the biological threshold. Once your transferrin protein is more than half saturated with iron, the body can't bind it all properly. That's when you start getting significant amounts of that toxic NTBI forming.
Ah, there's the NTBI again, the bad stuff. And the source says standard tests often miss this NTBI.
That's right. Your usual imaging, like X-rays, MRIs, even tissue biopsies, they don't typically see NTBI. Yeah. So you can have this cellular iron overload causing problems, but the tests might look negative for classic iron overload.
Wow. So are there any tests that can see it?
Well, the source does mention one specialized technique, B-mode TCS of the substantia nigra. It's a specific type of brain ultrasound. Apparently, it can pick up signals related to both ferritin and NTBI in that particular brain region, but it's not a routine test at all.
Okay, so not something you'd usually get. So we have low ferritin, low static transferrin, and transferrin saturation over 50%. What's the fourth piece?
The fourth is just serum iron levels the amount of iron floating in your blood at that moment.
Okay.
But the source stresses these are only really relevant when you look at them together with the high transferrin saturation and that static low transferrin on their own. Serum iron can jump around a lot depending on what you just ate. They can be misleading otherwise.
So it's really the combination of all 4, that specific pattern, that screams H63D syndrome.
Exactly, that constellation. But it's not just the labs.
Right. Symptoms matter too.
Absolutely. A diagnosis requires both that specific lab profile and matching clinical symptoms. You need both pieces.
And if you have both the labs and the symptoms?
Then genetic testing becomes mandatory, according to the source. You need to confirm that homozygous HFE H63D gene mutation.
Okay, that makes sense. Now this next part seems really critical. The source talks about diet, but also warns strongly against some standard treatments.
Yes, this is crucial because diet is so important. Even someone quite affected by H63D might actually have their transferrin saturation dip below 50% if they're on a really low iron diet.
So diet is the main lever here.
The source calls nutrition the only effective control factor, which leads directly to the warning.
Which is about chelation therapy or other iron-lowering drugs.
Exactly. Things used for acute iron poisoning. The source says they are dangerous, strongly advises against them for H63D.
Why dangerous? What happened?
Because those treatments tend to lower ferritin first. But in H63D, that low-ish ferritin is actually acting as the only sort of protective buffer against the NTBI that's already building up inside the cells.
Ah, I see.
So if you pull down the ferritin without dealing with the cellular NTBI, you can actually destabilize things badly, make the person much worse, potentially life-threateningly so.
Wow, that's a huge warning. Standard treatments could backfire badly.
It's a really stark warning in the material, yeah. Don't use standard iron depletion methods here.
Okay, and the scope of this.
Yeah.
How many people might be walking around with this undiagnosed?
The source estimates potentially thousands of patients with various forms of H63D syndrome just missed because that lab pattern isn't being recognized.
And it mentions a specific type, type 3, Oshtoran Syndrome.
Yes, it specifically calls out type 3, or Oshtoran Syndrome, noting it can potentially lead to sudden death in advanced stages, which really highlights the need for earlier recognition.
That is incredibly alarming, and it sounds like the symptoms themselves add to the confusion.
They really do. The symptoms often get treated as separate issues, like doctors see anxiety or OCD or maybe concentration problems, especially early on.
So they might think it's purely psychological.
Exactly. The source mentions obsessive-compulsive traits, anxiety disorders, eating disorders that don't seem to have a clear psychological trigger, irritability, Kinax, focus issues.
And the go-to might be therapy or psychiatric meds.
Which might be inappropriate if the root cause is actually this iron dysregulation messing with brain function. The source also flags fatty liver in teenagers or young adults, even if they have a normal BMI.
Another sign that could be easily missed or blamed on something else.
Right. And given that NTBI causes this silent, steady damage, the source really pushes for checking iron profiles early in kids and adolescents who show these kinds of symptoms.
What other kinds of systemic damage can happen down the line?
Well, liver dysfunction is common, maybe subtle inflammation or fat buildup, problems with fat and sugar metabolism, and then potential functional or even structural damage to the central nervous system, the brain, liver, heart, skin, even the gonads. It's quite widespread.
It really affects the whole system. Let's revisit that NTBI toxicity. Why does it happen at 50% saturation?
It's about transferrin's binding capacity. Think of transferrin like little taxis for iron. Once more than half the taxis are full, 50% saturation, there isn't enough transport capacity for all the iron coming in.
So the leftover iron becomes unbound.
Exactly. Unbound free iron, that's NTBI. And it doesn't matter how much ferritin storage you have at that point. If saturation's over 50%, NTBI forms. And this stuff is described as aggressive, highly reactive.
Just floating around causing trouble.
Pretty much. It distributes uncontrollably and causes oxidative stress, cellular damage wherever it goes.
And this helps explain why different specialists might miss it.
Absolutely. The source lays it out clearly. Hematologists might focus on the ferritin, see it's low or borderline, and think, okay, no iron overload here, missing the significance of the saturation and static transferrin.
Oh, right.
Psychiatrists see the neurological symptoms, anxiety, OCD, focus issues, and treat those directly, not necessarily looking for an underlying metabolic cause like iron dysregulation.
And the organ specialists.
Cardiologists, endocrinologists, hepatologists, they see the damage in the heart or the metabolic system or the liver, and they treat that. They focus on the organ naturally, but might miss the systemic pattern connecting it all back to H63D.
Even primary care doctors might just see a collection of seemingly unrelated complaints.
Exactly. Fragmented symptoms. They might not connect the dots to this one underlying syndrome. It paints a picture of, well, a system potentially too fragmented to easily spot these systemic conditions.
But the source says there is a solution, and it's surprisingly simple.
Yeah, relatively simple anyway. This highly toxic condition is measurable with those standard labs, if you know what to look for. And it's manageable primarily through diet, a physician-guided, low-iron diet.
Which is a world away from complex drug regimens.
Totally. And the source points this out. There aren't really specific, profitable drugs for H63D itself. If symptoms get bad later on, the treatments used are often just inexpensive generic medications to manage those specific symptoms.
You almost have to wonder, cynical as it sounds, if the lack of a big pharma payday contributes to the lack of awareness.
It's a thought, isn't it? The source doesn't explicitly say that, but it notes the contrast. The main management is dietary control, not a patented pill. The symptom management uses generics. There isn't a huge financial engine driving awareness or drug development specifically for H63D.
And it also distinguishes between managing adults and kids.
Yes, that's important. For adults who are already symptomatic, treatment is often more about managing those symptoms, improving quality of life, maybe extending lifespan. But the real hope is early diagnosis.
In childhood or adolescence.
Right. If you catch it early, a carefully managed low-iron diet and monitoring can potentially prevent the disease from really progressing and causing major damage later on. That's the critical window.
So what's the big message for everyone listening, whether they're doctors or just interested in their own health?
The source kind of makes a call to action framed towards medical colleagues, but relevant for everyone.
Right.
It basically says, take this seriously. Be aware this blind spot exists.
Look at the labs.
Look closely at the routine labs. The pattern is often there. And even if you're not a doctor, understanding these markers, low ferritin, low static transferrin, high saturation, can empower you.
How so?
It helps you ask better questions. If you have a cluster of weird symptoms, maybe you look at your labs with your doctor and ask, hey, what about my transferrin saturation? Is my transferrin static? It promotes a more informed conversation.
Okay, so let's wrap this up. Key takeaways. H63D syndrome, it's common, it's often missed, because medical training hasn't focused enough on non-transferrin-bound iron, NTBI.
But it has clear signs in standard blood tests, that 4-value constellation we talked about. Low ferritin, low static transferrin, saturation often over 50%, and serum iron viewed in context.
And the main management strategy is dietary, a low-iron diet, not the standard iron-depleting treatments, which can be dangerous here.
Critically dangerous, yeah. And the lack of awareness, this medical blind spot for such a potentially impactful condition is, well, it's quite alarming.
It really is. It leaves you wondering, doesn't it? If something this seemingly clear, this measurable, can be so systematically overlooked.
What else might we be missing? What other fundamental health processes might we misunderstand or ignore because of how medicine is currently structured or taught?
Makes you think.
Yeah.
It definitely underscores why it's so important to be proactive, ask questions, and really engage with your own health data, especially around something as basic yet complex as iron.